Today we're going to talk about the modern Middle East. The modern Middle East is fascinating because it's in this middle ground in some ways between growing westernization and growing incorporation into an independent world that's dominated by Western practices and Western ideas. And then at the same time, powerful movements that want to resist this change and that want to push back against greater Western involvement in the Middle East, greater Western influence in the Middle East. And so at the same time as we see in a lot of ways the rejection of some Western ideas of individual liberation and independence that we saw in the modern West, we also see the adoption of Western economic models and Western government models, or at least the growing adoption of increased economic interdependence and increased government power. The history of the modern Middle East really is oriented in a lot of ways around the state of Israel. Now, the at least ideological origins of the state of Israel come from the early 20th century, a point where you see the rise of Jewish nationalism in Europe. And this Jewish nationalism we tend to refer to as Zionism. The rhetoric of the Jewish populations in Europe that they should have their own nationalism and should have their own nation state on their historic lands. After World War I and the conquest and defeat of the Ottoman Empire, Britain holds the lands of Palestine as a protectorate and invites Jews from across Europe to come to Palestine and settle there. And Jews begin to do so. And both Jewish settlers and the Palestinian inhabitants of the region resent British rule over the territory. After World War II, Britain, unable to resolve disputes between the Jews and the Palestinians, relinquishes control of the region of Palestine to the UN. The UN partitions the region of Palestine into the State of Israel and the State of Palestine. And still, both parties are unhappy. The Palestinians are unhappy because they feel that their land has been taken from them. And the Jews feel unhappy because the size of the State of Israel at this point is very small and very vulnerable, and so they feel that they can be attacked and wiped out very quickly. And also it doesn't include the city of Jerusalem, the heartland of at least the historical territories of the Jewish peoples. Over the next 20 years or so, up until the 1970s, we see Arab efforts from around the Middle East, typically led by Egypt in coordination with Syria and Jordan, but also by funding and encouraging Palestinian guerrilla warfare and attacks to overthrow the State of Israel. Nevertheless, the Israelis prove themselves to be a more than competent army and defeat the attempted invasions from these different Arab nations. They not only defeat these attempted invasions, but they also counterattack and expand their territory. Remember, they were concerned about how small it was. They expand their territory to include the city of Jerusalem and to include territories that, according to the UN, had been a part of Palestine. And so this creates further tension. The Israelis on one hand wish to defend this territory, and on the other hand, we see that the Palestinians feel that they are being unjustly occupied in breach of a UN deliberation by the State of Israel. Another important factor in the history of the Middle East is the production of oil. Oil production in the Middle East makes these countries, especially Saudi Arabia, much more wealthy and much more powerful. We see that when they feel that the West is providing too much support for Israel, they're able to put an embargo on oil exports from their regions, and it basically makes the price of oil skyrocket. It brings the Western nations hurriedly to the negotiating table and shows the growing influence that oil gives these countries and this region in, as I've said before, an economically interdependent world. We also see the rise of a secular dictatorship in Iraq led by Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein leads Iraq to war against Iran and then against Kuwait in an effort to gain control of more oil supplies. Both of these attempted invasions are unsuccessful, and the invasion of Kuwait is particularly notable for American involvement and also as Americans as the leadership of a worldwide coalition that includes Saudi Arabia. And the idea is that by spreading control of oil reserves among a number of countries, that means that the consumers of oil still have a greater influence in the price of oil. And so the nations that are buying oil from these oil producing countries have a greater say over the price of oil, have a greater influence over the price of oil than if there's one nation that has a monopoly over most or even a large amount of the oil reserves in the world. Lastly, we come to anti-Western movements. Remember that I said that there is a significant aspect of modern Middle Eastern culture that resents the influence of the West in the region, that resents efforts to modernize and westernize the Middle East. And we see this first of all in the nation of Iran. Remember that Iran had been invaded by Britain and Russia in order to provide a supply chain for Russia during World War II, and that the Shah that they put in place was something of a puppet of the West. And he is overthrown in 1979 in a revolution in Iran that brings to power a new Shiite Islam theocracy that is opposed to both the existence of the State of Israel and Western involvement and intervention in the Middle East. So that is Shia Islam, or more radical Shia Islam, and its rejection of the westernization of the Middle East. We also see the rejection of the westernization of the Middle East in the spread of Wahhabi Sunni Islam, especially in Saudi Arabia, which begins to fund the spread of this ideology. But we've also seen Americans fund and promote, or American governments fund and promote the spread of this ideology during the Cold War. When they provided arms and training for a group called Al-Qaeda to wage war against Russia and when the Russians invaded Afghanistan during the Cold War. And this group, Al-Qaeda, offers Saudi Arabia, led by bin Laden, led by a man called Osama bin Laden, offers Saudi Arabia support when Saddam Hussein attempts to invade Kuwait in 1991. And the Saudis reject Al-Qaeda's offer of support and instead choose American intervention and American assistance. And this is supposed to have enraged bin Laden, the rejection of his holy warriors and the presence of the American military, which he saw as symbolizing the West and the opposition to Islam in the West on the holy soil, holy Islamic soil of Saudi Arabia, and led him to begin to carry out terrorist attacks against the United States, most famously on September the 11th, 2001. And so that's where we'll bring our survey of Western civilization to an end.